Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. This is a re-record of our Taiwan war plan analysis stream. Effectively, the file from the recording was unfortunately corrupted, so it had no audio, which is not nearly as interesting. So I have sat down to re-record this one, and because we had a bunch of great questions come through from other streamers while we were doing it, I will effectively have some of those questions next to me as well, and we'll go through and add those to to this recording when it came through. With no further waiting, let's get cracking into it. So obviously this is more for the live stream more than the actual re-record, but feel free to put your hand up if you want to ask a question. I don't know how good it would be considering this is a recording, but you can always either send the questions through on our Discord or to the Red Line directly, and we usually answer them. Will be recorded, and the presentation will also be available. So the main reports we're basing this analysis here off are effectively these 5 here. They're great little reports and great war games, effectively going out through all the different scenarios. And again, particularly the CSIS one at the top here, they've taken a lot of time to game out almost every possible scenario, including effectively mechanisms that add chance and all the sort of stuff you would add in, because frankly, that's really important to put into this. So again, have a read of all these. We also use a lot of the congressional report stuff, effectively on what China's capacities are, what the building capacity is, where the Navy's at, all that good stuff as well. So if you really want to get a good understanding of where Taiwan and China is at the moment, that's probably a good place to start. Now, if you like maps, you'll like me. Don't worry, I've got lots and lots of maps. And if you want access to any of these maps, or you want me to send anything through, feel free to send through a request as well. I can send those across. So let's talk the central underlying problem in all of this. And I want to kind of put this up front so we can have it in the back of your head for the entire time, because these central problems will shape every decision that both sides will make throughout this conflict. It doesn't matter what happens, these will effectively be the underlying problems. For China, they're having political instability at home. We've got very high youth unemployment, the economy is not doing as well, things are starting to slow down, and this is, some of it is self-inflicted problems, some of it's to do with internal mechanisms in the country, some of it's to do with just the transition to a more developed economy. They're going out of that first stage economy and trying to get into a second. So there's lots of different factors, and that's a talk for a whole other time. Again, slowing Chinese economy. The idea of taking Taiwan is a central tenement of the party's platform. This is something that Xi has been talking about for a while. It's been one of his main policies, and Xi really does want to see himself as important to the Chinese state as Mao was. His ways worked very hard to put the Xi Jinping thought into the constitution, but it would cement him as the guy that redid it. He's been trying to do that politically, but it's a very difficult thing to do, and so far, even the money they've thrown at Taiwanese politics hasn't been successful. Now, one of the central problems in Russia's situation is Putin's isolation. Putin used to be surrounded by some pretty good generals and guys who'd fought wars and guys who understood how wars are fought and what wins battles and loses battles. Unfortunately, in recent years, particularly since COVID, Putin has isolated himself. And it's what tripped a lot of us up about the invasion of Ukraine, because we all were reading reports and we knew it was going to be an absolute cluster of a problem. And it was going to just go absolutely terribly in going into Ukraine. But Putin had isolated himself to a point where he's only getting information from guys like Bortnikov and Patrushev. And at that point, he's not playing with the same deck we are. He has his intel's telling him that that Ukraine will topple the moment he walks in, that the people are longing for a new leader, all this kind of rubbish that we know is untrue. We worry that right now Xi is not that isolated, but Xi is continuing to isolate himself more and more as time goes on. So there is that worry in coming into this. Now, this is the main problem, and this is why we are modeling this. Now, we could, someone in the stream did bring this up about, what about 2045, 2046? I think that's so far out that we can't really guarantee or predict that with any certainty. I would be hesitant to go back the other direction and look at what geopolitics was like in 2003 and say, what happens with China and Taiwan in 2030, 2026? So we're going to stick with 2026 because this is the year that most intelligence agencies, most naval colleges, most officers tend to think that if the war is going to happen, it happens in 26, 27. Somewhere around that barrel. And it's because of this graph. Now, effectively, what you see here is that US military ship production is fairly steady. And that's fine. The US has always been a quality of a quantity navy. The Chinese military capacity has been really rapidly rising over this period here, but it starts to peter out. Now, this is for a couple of reasons. The economy is obviously slowing down, but the big one is effectively that China has a fairly set budget for its navy, and what it's using at the moment to purchase new ships, they were going to have to continue to siphon money from what they use for purchases into repairing the ships they have, which means effectively they can't build ships at this same rate that they have here, and you peter off because now you're having to repair the ones you have. And with Taiwan, you're probably somewhere down here, slowly kind of ticking up and up and up. The biggest gap China will have between where it sits and where Taiwan sits is effectively 2026. Now, beyond that point, if the Chinese economy continues to slow down, or just generally if the Chinese Navy just stagnates, it just kind of peters, the gap between themselves and Taiwan will probably just continue to shrink, as well as the fact that the chip sanctions, a whole bunch of other factors might come into it as well. But this is the central problem, that China knows that for the best shot to do this, they want to really have the biggest possible gap between themselves and effectively Taiwan and the United States. So 2026 is the year that modeling works, which is why most studies, most suggestions, most war games are usually based in 2026. So the big problem, and this is the thing I wanted to keep in everyone's mind this entire time, 3 weeks or China will be defeated. Now, that's a crazy statement, but I will go through exactly why, and I'll go take you through every single movement of that. Just have that right locked into the back of your mind that it is 3 weeks or China will be defeated. And every decision will focus around trying to defeat Taiwan or capitulate Taiwan within 3 weeks. So let's move to the next question. The stakes. Why would both sides care about Taiwan? Now, ignore the fact that Taiwan's just a great country. It's very tied into the world economy, particularly in the semiconductor industry. From a Chinese and American defensive point of view, there's always been this theory of the chains. How real it is, I think it's hard to say. I think it's very much a down the road of what domino theory was back in the Cold War of, if Vietnam falls and Thailand goes, yada, yada, yada. But here's the theory anyway. Let's go through it. And there is some logic to it, though. So right now, this is kind of the barrier of where Chinese Navy can feel comfortable operating. Again, we'll go through this a bit more, in the naval sections. But this is the where China really feels it can easily operate. And this is because effectively you've got US bases and whatnot in South Korea, Japan, and obviously the Ryukyu Islands down here blocks them in. So if China was to, let's say, try and get ships out of Shanghai and barreling towards Samoa, in a case of a war, going past these islands is a real pain in the ass because you risk being shot upon every single time. Obviously Taiwan's, it's right there, and this little really pushes the line in. The Philippines, if you model on the fact they're probably going to go with the Americans, and the South China Sea, you get stuck effectively most of the time near the Malacca Strait. Now, if they can take Taiwan, the line moves like this, effectively that now there is a much easier time of projecting out into the Pacific Ocean, that effectively you could have ships dock and get their supplies up and whatnot in Taipei and push out, and there's not any of these enemy island chains in this gap here that effectively allows the Chinese to project much easier out into the Pacific Ocean, which if you're paranoid and in Washington, you might consider that makes this easier, because the Philippines have always been kind of on the defense, they might see a change in the wind. And now you have China very easily able to project out to here, to which then a lot of these countries who are maybe already have large amounts of Chinese investment may see the winds change and go, okay, we're going to side with China now. And then there's another wider chain at that point, which effectively shows that China would have control of this area or would operate freely within this area and be the dominant player. Now, again, I don't know how correct that is, but I think it makes some strategic sense. Again, but that just kind of puts out why the US feels that Taiwan's so important, because again, Taiwan is the first stepping stone to something bigger in their opinion. So let's go through the leaders on who we think would actually be in power, set some parameters for what we go through for the rest of the war. Now, Xi Jinping, we're going to put him in as the leader of China. I think that's a fair thing to say going to 26. It's not a massive change from now. How authoritarian he decides to get will definitely influence this. I think if he does become more authoritarian, we up the chance of a war here. Lei Ching-te from the DPP party, effectively they're the most likely candidate or most likely party to win the next Taiwanese election, which effectively means it's a continuation of current policy. The big modeling in this, and this is where your modeling just drastically changes, is if Biden or Trump wins the 2024 election. Biden operates in a very consensus way. He operates mostly working quite closely with members of the State Department, with fairly conventional Washington guys who've been there for a very long time. So we can pretty well model what his response to each thing's going to be. He doesn't surprise most people geopolitically, which makes it a lot easier to model a Biden response to this conflict. Trump is much harder to model with any of this. You know, if you told me that Trump would declare war on China and authorize the use of nuclear weapons on day one, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. I also don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that China says Taiwan who, new phone who dis, and just leaves the conflict completely. It's much harder to model Trump, and I think that's a whole other conversation. I think we could probably, you know, maybe when we get close to the election, have that conversation. With this particular stream, let's just stick with Biden as the president. So Biden, but let's also give him a fairly thin margin in Congress. You know, the US is not going to solve its political differences overnight. So we'll make sure that he has to operate with the voters in mind, with the opinion of Congress in mind, and he can't just, you know, do whatever he feels like. Now, preconditions. So these are things I think it's always important to set out. You know, what does the board look like before we engage in this conflict? So preconditions for all. Now, we don't live in Viking times, so you can cross the channel at any time of the year effectively. But in April or October is usually when the channel is at its calmest, it's at its easiest. And if you're, as we'll go through a bit later on, trying to unload gear from boats and trying to, you know, effectively get stuff on shore, you want the water to be calm as possible. So it's why most war games that focus on Taiwan, China, we usually model an April or October invasion. That's when the waters are best to do this. So it doesn't matter which one, but April, October. Taiwan is also fairly stable in this scenario. We're not going to put our thumb on the scale for that particular thing. Let's keep it what it is, 2026, 2027, as we went through earlier. And that Ukraine has come to an end or a standstill. You know, effectively, we want to just give all sides a bit of a free hand. Now, for China, they will need about 6 months prep time to pull off something like this. Now, you can shorten this and extend this, as we'll go through, but you can also do practice runs. You know, if you were, and what I want to do throughout this is kind of, particularly in the live stream, it was great because I could ask people what their opinions were. But if you're listening to the re-record, have a bit of a think to yourself on what you would do in the situation, because every decision you will make as the leader of China or the United States will have a spectrum of different results. You know, if you are China right now, you are deciding, okay, the best way to lower your prep time and get your efficiency up on it for preparing for something like this is by running lots and lots of drills. So quite often, let's say if, you know, the Uzbeks or the Russians are going to go plan some big offensive, you know, they might run a drill a couple of months beforehand because where they can leave their communications equipment or some of their fuel or whatever behind and ready to go for when they come back and do the real one. It's kind of already set up. The communications equipment's already there. The extra dock capacity is already there. They've kind of already done some of the prep work. So you can lower it. But by doing so, by running these preps beforehand, you're giving your opponent a good look at how you operate. So when the Russians, let's say, do their big Vostok exercises, so running, how long will it take to get a bunch of Russian forces from the west of the country all the way to Vladivostok in the east? We can then get a really good idea on how efficient the Russian rail forces are, how efficient their movements are, how they do it, what they're going to prioritize, what lines they need to shut down. It just gives us so many different boxes that we can look for if an invasion is going to happen again. When India went and did a similar exercise to see how quickly can we mobilize troops and get them to the border with Pakistan, what should have taken 3 days took a month and a half. And that then sent shockwaves to the Indian military and also effectively gave Pakistan a massive look into what capacity the Indian military had because they did this prep and this run before. But in saying that, there's always that sort of balance between how prepared you want to be and how well drilled do you want your soldiers to be, particularly for a really complex operation like an amphibious one, versus how much do you want to give away on what you've got, what cards you have up your sleeve. So again, have a think to yourself on what you feel is the priority in this. China will need to stockpile oil. It's very well known that China has a bit of a shortage of oil. If China's anticipating a short war, which again, 3 weeks is what we're talking here, they won't have to stockpile gargantuan amounts. But if they're thinking that, hey, there's a risk that we may get cut off fairly quickly, they'll need to start stockpiling. Now, Russia can effectively supply some of what they need, and they can turn to some of the Central Asians for bits and pieces as well. But remember, if you stockpile beforehand, you're not going to get gouged as hard on the back end. What we saw is when the Ukraine war kicked off, or the 2022 offensive kicked off, effectively that the price of gas spiked so quickly because there's a shortage now. And if there is a shortage of oil, this war kicks off, there's very likely to be a spike in the price. So does China want to buy it at the spike price or buy it at the previous price? China will be impacted by ongoing chip sanctions. Biden's chips sanctions have really hurt the Chinese, and it's going to hurt the amount of effectively hypersonic missiles and high-end missiles they can manufacture. So we're going to take the growth rates they've had of missile production last year or two, and kind of let it go on those numbers rather than any sort of exponential spike, because that is a bit of a problem they have at the moment. Dumb bombs, easier things to manufacture, probably still no problem. It's the hypersonics, it's some of the really complex stuff that becomes problematic, and then quantum computing and a whole bunch of other things. So let's give them a whole bunch of stuff on day one. That's going to be coming in more important later on. And China has access to private ships. Now, if you actually look at what China has available to as amphibious ships, what they're designed to do is amphibious warfare, it's something like 22, 24, depending on what source you want to use, which is nowhere near enough for an operation like this. What China has been doing is looking at conversion packs for civilian ships. And that can be used for either just using a lot of these civilian ships to get their stuff ashore, or some of it can be used for parking a MRLS system on top of a ship and just using it as a mobile floating battery, either for anti-aircraft operations or for just attacking the shore. So we will have it in this kind of modeling here, because it is very likely that if China does go to war, that they will just usurp a bunch of the private ships that are in Chinese waters, and that Xi has centralized power by about 25%. Again, I think that's a parameter that needs to happen. Otherwise, China just doesn't go to war. There are too many members of the senior Chinese leadership at the moment who would just say, don't do this. It's not going to work. And we'll go through why later on. So Taiwan's preconditions. Taiwan will take 6 months to call up reserves. How Taiwan's changing its military structure. Taiwan used to have this military built around the idea that if China were to invade, everyone grabs their sticks and guns and runs into the mountains and fights to the last man, and which is a fine model for the 1940s and 50s. I don't think that's what Taiwan does. And it was lucky we actually had someone in the stream who was from Taiwan and has done his army service and could be recalled up, who was, effectively agreeing with everything we're going through here and gave the situation, saying, hey, look, it would take me a month. I've been out of the army for a little bit. It'd take me a month to be able to shoot straight. And that's probably about standard. If we are modeling this sort of invasion, again, we'll go through this later on in more detail, but Taiwan will call up its reservists, but they're not going to be frontline troops. It's going to take a while to fit them out, to get them retrained, to fight with them again, to get them working in formations that you can hold every bit of the line. We can probably get a whole bunch of guns in a whole bunch of hands. That's fine. But the first couple of days will be absolute chaos. As we'll go through later, because of the rockets, because of the attacks, because of the chaos that China will want to sow in the first couple of days. But the actual troops that China puts ashore are not going to be massive in number in the first little while. And therefore, you don't need these massive divisions to fight. You need better quality divisions that can hold small parts of the line. And again, you need to be able to supply them. So you want probably a smaller force, better supply, better equipped that you can go for. Taiwan is even sort of starting to pull back from this high amount of conscription reserve numbers, because in peacetime, when you take troops out of the working pool, the labor pool, and make them go and do reserve functions or effectively army duties, not only are you hurting their careers, which has long-standing problems, but you're not earning money to go pay taxes into your economy. In peacetime, you're probably better off keeping these guys in their jobs and having a much more professionalized army. Now, different countries do different things. Ukraine was do or die. You call everyone up. And again, if Taiwan was do or die, that's probably the way you go. As we'll go through, it's probably not do or die. So this is a bit of a different scenario. Israel has a very, very high capacity to sort of mobilizing reserves and can really get people back in the field. They can put about 300,000 in the field very quickly. The difference is that those guys have a very do or die situation because there's no strategic depth in the country. And they really want to call up very quickly, because if they're attacked from three sides, they feel like every day makes the difference. Whereas with Taiwan, it's actually the opposite. The longer the war goes on, the more chance Taiwan has to win this thing. So if Taiwan has enough good troops that can, let's say, hold the line in the south, then congrats, you can stop the war long enough that the cavalry comes in and saves the day. And we'll go through all of that in more detail, but I think there was a really good question asked during the original panel. So it's kind of good to go why the call-up time is so long, because that is what effectively you probably need to get them all refitted and rekitted. Taiwan will have medium to low stockpiles of oil and gas. Let's just go with what they have at the moment. The DPP will hold power and building up defenses. So Taiwan is building up defenses, ready to fight these kind of things. But again, we just don't want to have any crazy thumps on scales that they require a nuclear weapon or something in the next 2 years. Again, we're just kind of laying parameters here. And we're not going to do a pre-call to conscription. That's a possibility. Okay, Biden's in the White House for the US. US fleets are on regular patrols. We're going to have all the US forces just all waiting in Pearl Harbor. They're not at war with Iraq or Lebanon or somewhere else. I think that's a really big parameter. One of the ways that China can have a bit of an advantage here, if you want to play out lots of different scenarios, is that the US get dragged into a war in Iran. And that chews up so much equipment and men that it actually makes the response capacity to go into Taiwan much more difficult. No new pacts are signed. We're not going to have a CETO or anything crazy. We have AUKUS, NATO, but we're not going to go into any crazy new pacts. And the US will not launch a first strike. So, part 5, the build-up. So, China's military spending has been growing. The military spending is also very odd to try and model because there's a lot of things that I would probably consider that should be in there. A lot of space programs, the giant national police force they have, all these kind of things and R&D should really be in China's military spending calculations, but isn't. But generally, China doesn't really have the massive capacity to ramp up military spending by, let's add 2 or 3% of GDP to military spending. We're just going to kind of keep it where it is. What they buy over the next couple of years will kind of tell us what they're thinking. Again, I'm a huge believer in the sort of overarching principle that procurement tells you a lot, because what you buy today is what you fight within 6-7 years time. So if we see China effectively looking at more policing forces, more disaster response forces, then it may give us an idea that they may be ignoring Taiwan as a military objective going forward. How long will the build-up be? This is another real calculation and problem that a lot of militaries have to think about. The more people you tell about an invasion or about an objective or about whatever you're doing, the more chance it leaks. And what we saw again with the war in Ukraine, I think I'm going to use lots of Ukraine analogies throughout this whole thing, is the fact that because Russia kept it so secret, and they did keep it quite well hidden for a long time, it caused problems down the line. Russia probably went to one end of the scale rather than the other. The other end of the scale is like announcing something like Obama announcing the surge into Iraq and saying, we're going to do this, and just giving everyone warning it's coming way down the line. With Russia, 2 months, 3 months out, Blinken and whatnot was having meetings with Russian officials and catching them off guard by being like, hey, we know this thing's coming in February. And even they didn't know. When it gets down to the real lower ranks, the guys who are most likely to post it on their TikToks, you are really causing problems by, a lot of the Russian soldiers, particularly the ones north of Kiev, stationed in Belarus, were only told they're going into Ukraine 12 hours beforehand, which is great for operational security. It took a lot of people by surprise. Ukraine wasn't ready for this thing as well as they could have been. But with a corrupt army like Russia, and admittedly China's to a lesser extent, but still has corruption throughout the army, it meant that on day one, when those tanks took off down the road towards Kiev, a lot of them stopped because they ran out of fuel. That's a massive problem, because what had been happening over the time, and having been out of these places and spoken with Russian soldiers, there's not a lot you can't buy if they think they can get away with it. So Russian soldiers have been doing things like selling the fuel out of the tanks, trading it for booze money, whatever they want to do with it. Fine, during peacetime, it doesn't matter. If you just keep selling the fuel, and then when, hey, we're doing a drill next week, they can go refill the tank up. But if you're told, hey, we're going into battle in 12 hours, let's get prepped and ready to go, you don't have time to go refill that tank you've siphoned from without alerting your senior commander that you were the one who stole the fuel in the first place. So you end up having a bunch of tanks that are lacking fuel and lacking capacity because you haven't told enough people. So that's the spectrum. You don't want to, if you announce, hey, we're going to be invading Taiwan in 6 months, great. But you're giving everyone a chance to rearm and get ready and fight you and be better prepared for when you land. But you go the other way, you don't tell anyone until the very last moment, then a lot of your tanks might be out of fuel, a lot of your stock, medical supply, whatever it is, may have been, what is on the shelf may be very different to what is actually in reality. And that's a real problem. Also, you just don't drill them enough. A lot of these guys were hungover. Maybe they haven't shot their guns in months. They haven't done a lot of practice, and that hurts you going into this thing. You train very differently if you think you're going to war than if you think you're going to be just sitting in Belarus for 6 months. Another big factor in this, and again, we'll get back to maps and all the fun stuff in a bit, is what has the US sent to Taiwan? So the US has, I'm going to use Israel a bit of a chat here, but the US keeps a lot of weapons that are owned by the United States but sit in bunkers in Israel. So what it means is if war breaks out, the Americans could just rock up and they could access their own equipment or just loan it to Israel when required. So we don't know how much equipment the US has given to Taiwan at this point in time. I would be a safe bet, without confirming or denying anything, that there's a lot more anti-ship missiles in Taiwan than is probably in open source knowledge. But that will obviously be a big factor. If, let's say, the US was to go and give Taiwan a whole bunch of, on one end, just go to THAAD batteries, everything they could possibly ask for, that may antagonize China to strike out of, let's do this before they get in. But there may be a lot more on Taiwan than we realize sitting in bunkers. So again, that's going to be part of your build up, is how much the US secretly get into Taiwan or give Taiwan in preparation of this. So if for China 3 months, which is too short, you haven't got any drill, you've got hardly any of the fuel, the communications, you're cutting corners everywhere, it's too short. 12 months is probably too long. And again, if you are deploying your troops for 12 months in prep for this thing, a lot of them are going to get bored and want to go home. A lot of them are going to get lazy in that time. You're going to burn through more supply, more kit, more equipment during these sort of operations. So you might just be burning through your supplies and cash and everything else just in the build-up stage rather than actually where you're going to need it. So there is going to be a bit of a spectrum, 3 months to 12 months. But let's be middle of the road and classic breadline, and we'll just sit somewhere in the middle there and say, 6 months build up from Xi signing the piece of paper to, we'll call it Z-Day, when they're going to kick off down and cross the strait. Casus belli. So how would China justify a war? So the lots of different ways they could do this. I think the most likely are effectively China stoking, let's say, a pro-PRC rally in Taipei. March on a day that's important to Taiwan citizens, let members of the Chinese security services in there and obviously plain clothed, kick off a riot and let those guys come under attack by protesters, and China then calls a special policing action to go in and effectively, we're coming in not because we want to invade Taiwan, but because we need to guarantee the security of our Chinese citizens living on Taiwan. Or just fakes it and says, hey, Taiwan fired upon a Chinese ship. We are responding in kind. I think not hugely important to our modeling here, but I think it's always good to kind of lay out what a likely justification of war would be. Taiwan, on the other hand, will probably want to play the same role that Zelensky did. And a lot of people criticized him in the early stages, particularly, in the day 1, 2, 3 of the conflict, going, why would you ignore the information? Why wouldn't you mobilize earlier? Why wouldn't you start prepping for a war with Russia? Now, the difference is if he starts prepping, getting his troops ready, rushing troops to the border, it does make it look like it's a both sides kind of thing. It's not, it's 100% not, but there is a risk of that. For what Zelensky might have gained by an extra week of mobilization is probably not worth what he gained in international political support by him not giving the Russians what they wanted and ratcheting the situation, making sure it was a pretty clean-cut case of Russia is attacking a nation who was not looking for war. And that's going to be very important for Taiwan. We don't want any, let's say, Republican legislator to be able to go, well, Taiwan was antagonizing them and, I don't think we should get involved here. You don't want to give anyone those options. We also won't suggest that, if the US will not forward deploy to avoid antagonizing. Same exact thing. Biden may call them out and say, we have intel, you're going to do this. They may tell them not to do anything stupid. But the US forward deploying, again, just risks making it look a bit odd to their allies. Again, we'll go through this a bit later on, but it's very important that more and more allies jump in and support the United States in this operation. By antagonizing, it makes it harder for your Japans and your Philippines and those kind of guys to be able to come in and justify and say, you guys started it, effectively. Okay, first strike. This is probably the most important decision that Xi will make throughout the entire conflict. So we'll go through some of the parameters on what we're playing with here, and then I'll go through kind of the 4 decisions that Xi would make and why we think, which case he'll take. So missile ranges is important to kind of have in the back of your mind. So this is effectively short-range ballistic missiles. So this is what the majority of China's military missile force is going to be. You can see that doesn't project all that far out. So most of your targets will want to be in here, Taiwan ranged, effectively. This is where the majority of China's missiles are going to be. Next one's going to be your medium range stuff. And you can see we now start to include more important targets that will come into a lot of this later on. So that's your Japans, that's your Guams, some of these Pacific Island nations, really small ones like Palau that will probably get dragged into this. It's the Ryukyu Islands. These are the real ones you want to be using for your first strike scenario. China's got a growing arsenal of these things, but not as much as they probably would like, and that's going to be limiting. But again, just have this in the back of your mind. Next one is your long range. China actually doesn't have a lot of these. This is the really long range stuff. This is what you would effectively hit the United States or Australia or any of these targets with, and it's mostly for the nuclear arsenals. We won't see a lot of these come into play. So effectively that medium circle we were talking about, this medium circle here that we were showing, is going to be effectively what you're mostly looking at for your first strikes. Now, the other one is cruise missiles. So effectively anything ship-wise that operates within this space, and this circle will move as if your Air Force is firing these things or your submarines are firing these things. But you can just see that there's a fairly big operational range, considering if you're let's say the US and you want to be operating carriers to do lots and lots of sortie work over Taiwan, and we'll go through this a bit later, which could be a drinking game with the amount of times I'm saying that at the moment. If you're operating in here, yeah, great. You can run way more sorties each day across Taiwan. Fantastic. You can do 2-3 a day. Great, fantastic. But you're also within range of lots more missiles than if you were to, let's say, operate out here, where you can do much less sortie rate, but you're also out of range of most of the HN1s and HN2s. The big one is going to be obviously the hypersonic missiles, the DF-17s. This is the range of those guys. A lot of those can come off other operating systems. There's been a big hoo-ha about China putting them on even civilian ships, effectively parking a launcher on the sort of the bed of a civilian ship and using that as a flying platform for these things. That's definitely going to be a possibility, but that's a first strike kind of weapon. If you're doing that, you're going to be much easier to see it coming. Whereas if it's firing from the Chinese mainland, then that's the more likely scenario for let's call it day 2 through to the end of the conflict. And that would be, this is the range you're talking about. So yeah, that does, just have that in the back of your mind. First targets. As I go through, more aggressive, less resistance, more enemies, and less aggressive equals more earlier resistance, less enemies. Now, this is a scenario that I see brought up quite often, a Taiwan blockade. This would be a very similar scenario to the US blockade of Cuba in the early 60s. The idea would be that we have our riot, China says they want to defend, and they have an arms quarantine or some ridiculous thing like that. And they can choke Taiwan economically like this without having to fire a shot or invade. I think this is one of the more likely options out of the 4 we're presenting here today, but it does have one absolutely critical flaw. Effectively, this. If I'm the US and I see this blockade of Taiwan, rather than having this amazing day 1 strike, and we'll go through that a bit later, I can then just effectively put together particularly if I really want to do this nicely, a multi-nationed task force of Japanese, Australian, United States. You put some ships you're willing to lose to do this, but you put together a nice little force and you run the blockade. And you make sure that you are publicizing it. You make sure that you are talking about, this is full of baby medicine and oil and hugs and kisses for the people of Taiwan. Because then China is stuck in a position of either A, firing upon that blockade and starting the war, which will drag in all of the other nations immediately. So holy shit. Or B, not firing upon it, and the United States can effectively just keep running that blockade. And you'd have exactly what happened to the Soviets, where the United States put out a boycott of a lot of Soviet goods because this was a massive escalation in the Soviet aggressiveness in Berlin and East Germany. And the Americans, it cost them a buttload of money to run the Berlin airlift. Effectively, when the Soviets cut the roads from West Germany to Berlin, it cost a huge amount of money to keep those planes coming in every day, dropping off supplies, but it kept it open and the Soviets had to end up backing down in the end. The other advantage of this for the United States is rather than effectively what the other scenarios we have here are, where you catch them by surprise and there's this scramble in Washington to kind of figure out what to do and get everything together and pull all your troops and cancel leaves and get everyone back to stations and whatnot. With this, the US can just let Taiwan sit under blockade for 3 weeks happily. And then you run through the blockade and you have everything ready to go right there. And then if China does shoot upon blockade, effectively declaring war, great. Now you have everything ready to go and you can have US air power over the island within Z-Day 1, Z-Day 2, really, really early in the conflict. That's a really bad problem for China, as we'll go through. So this scenario, if it goes well, because the US will run the blockade, you may see Japan or something like Canada not willing to get involved in the conflict. Canada having a very large Chinese population and large trade with China, Japan having large trade with China and probably not wanting to risk getting attacked if they can avoid it. If you have Japan in the convoy, convince them to join the convoy, that would drag them in. But if this is a scenario where you see the least amount of allied forces probably declaring war on China, because again, because it would require that extra step of the US going in to run the blockade, that does give some of these nations like the Philippines and Indonesia an out to say, hey, look, we don't want war. We hope the US doesn't run the blockade and we hope China de-escalates, whatever you want, nice and easy you want to say. It just gives everyone an ability to get out of the conflict without losing face. Material-wise, I can't see Russia jumping into the conflict. I think it's probably going to be a very similar situation to what China is for Russia at the moment. So materially, they'll probably supply what they can. I think if it's the US going and running the blockade, that gives the Russians a bit of justification to be able to give military equipment, or whatever they have left in military equipment, should I say, to China. North Korea as well. But again, North Korea is probably more likely just going to sell surplus munitions and whatnot to China at a very exorbitant price. Number 2. Now, if you're China, you have one shot, one opportunity to make a massive first strike. After you do that strike, your enemy is alerted. They've got their airplanes ready to go. They've maybe moved their senior leadership into bunkers. Their population's ready to go. Their economy's in a war footing. You have one shot at declaring the war, and that is the big advantage China has in all of this. So, classic example, airplanes. An F-35 in the air is a deadly war machine, a brilliant piece of kit. On the ground, it has the same capacity of warfighting as a bus. It's not very good when it's on the ground. Now, if you are thinking, okay, we could hit all of Taiwan's air force in day 1, get everything while it's on the ground, try and knock out all of their navy, as much of their naval forces while they're sitting in port, try and knock out all of their power stations, even try and kill off the government on day 1. If we can absolutely pummel Taiwan, try and destroy every bridge, road, everything we can with a massive amount of missile strikes. And China has a massive, massive amount of missiles ready to do something like this. That's why you go for these massive first strikes. And if you're the history nerd like me, it will start to be ringing Pearl Harbor in your ears. And that's for exactly this purpose. The Japanese had it in their mind that if they could knock out as much of the US Pacific Fleet, it would buy them time to grab as much of the Pacific theater as possible and make it much harder to come back and invade. And again, we'll go through a lot of stuff later on, but the modeling would show that if the US can arrive on Taiwan whilst, let's say, Taipei or ports are still open and they can just land men, this is an operation they lose, 10, 30,000. If they want to go and retake Taiwan for a whole myriad of reasons after, let's say, China has secured the island, that's a 300, 400,000 person casualty operation. It's a horrifying operation to pull off at that point. So if you're China and you have 3 weeks and you can capitulate Taiwan before the US get there, the US may even just back down and say, we'll fight another day. Again, we'll go through why that scenario probably won't play out the way they think it does, but that's the general thinking and consensus around a lot of these war games and whatnot, is that, so the Taiwan scenario only is not a bad scenario. I can see why you do it because you are knocking out as much as you can of Taiwan. But the trouble is that, okay, you do that, and day 1, the Americans declare war, or day 2, or whatever you want to say. And now you have all of the American assets sitting in the Pacific who will be harassing you from day 1. American ships at Pearl will go to sea. You'll start to see fighters coming in from Guam and possibly Japan. We've got Japan modeled here for bases. all coming in on day one. You are actually having to fight those F-35s. And that's pretty terrifying because those F-35s are going to be real nasty. That's a real pain in the ass. And if you are modeling your every thought on 3 weeks, do you really want to be losing your air superiority and fighting for air superiority on day one? You know, that's the trouble with this case two, is that you just strike Taiwan, you have a better chance of other countries staying out of the conflict, but you're fighting those F-35s. You only have the one shot at... Case three is effectively modeling on that China will go and hit places like Guam and some of the US bases in the Ryukyus. This model is one that I see brought up quite a lot because it knocks out a whole bunch of the F-35s, but the aim here is not to bring Japan and the Philippines into the war. And if they weren't going to get into the war, this actually might be a pretty good model because Guam is not a huge runway. It's not a huge air capacity. Neither are any of these Pacific islands. So it becomes a really difficult operation. The trouble is that I honestly can't see that if they're going to go down that road and they've struck and they killed US servicemen, particularly on day one where you'd probably want to kill an aircraft carrier for the US as well. Again, spoiler alert, but most of these war games suggest the US loses 1 to 2 aircraft carriers in the first couple of days. That is going to probably elicit United Kingdom and Japan entry to the war. You can see Australia actually jumps in every single scenario because, I don't think we have a foreign policy anymore. Obviously, that's a joke for legal reasons. If you are going to go down that road, that case only works if Japan does not enter the war, in which case that's a pretty bad bet to make based on the current administration and trajectory of the Japanese military. So I would be betting they would enter the war, in which case you now move to maximum attack. You want to hit every single F-35. I put it straight. You want to hit every US base in Japan, every Japanese airfield you can, anything in the north of the Philippines that the Americans have. Guam, you want to absolutely to rubble. Really hit Taiwan. Now, this is a really big scenario, and it will absolutely devastate on day one. Because of the fact that it will catch a lot of people off guard is the first reason. But the second is anti-ballistic missile interception rates. Now, what we saw, particularly with the sort of October 7th attacks on Israel, something like the Iron Dome or THAAD is designed to shoot one missile coming in toward you. That's the main point of the system. It can shoot more, but that's the main point. If you are shooting one, there's a good chance it intercepts. If you're shooting 20, 30, 40, 50, it can't get them all. And if you only need a couple to hit the targets, then you can just launch everything you have and you'll make it past most of the missile defenses. You know that you'll hit a lot of F-35s on the ground. You'll probably knock out half to 60% of all the US planes sitting in this area, the Western Pacific. And that's devastating. That buys you a lot of time, but there's two problems with it. One, to do this at this scale will require the Chinese rocket forces and military to effectively burn through 70% is not an unreasonable number. I mean, it's hard to get the exact numbers on what you require here. It depends how much the US have in the region on that particular day. 70% is not an unreasonable number. And great, you've now done all this damage. You've really hurt the US Pacific response. But now you only have 30% missile capacity left to fight the rest of the war. And considering that A, the chip sanctions are in, and B, that we're talking a very short war here, that's it. You can't have new replacement supply. So let's go to who gets involved, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. But yeah, this is the most likely scenario in my mind, because again, if you're playing along here and you think, okay, well, the blockade's probably going to be run anyway. Case 2 has US Air Force rocking up on day 1. Case 3 has US Air Force rocking up on day 1 from Japan. I might as well go for case 4, which is full strikes. Let's knock out everything we can in the Pacific in the hopes, much like Japan in 41, that you can take as much ground and capture Taiwan and make it from that sort of 20,000 dead to 400,000 dead in that 3 weeks time. We have using somewhere between 50 and 70% of your missiles on day 1. So US rules of engagement. We are wanting to set up public opinion here and the length of the war, and that's really important. Now, if you're Biden, you want to come to that podium and give your best, a day that will live in infamy speech. But you'll also want to set public opinion, not only for the domestic markets, not only for the domestic audience at home, but also for the financial and for international partners. Now, if you are saying, pounding your fist on the podium and saying, we are going to invade the Chinese mainland and we are going to raise the stars and stripes over Beijing. That's very hard for allies to get involved because everyone knows that a land war in China is going to be a nightmare. If Biden comes to the table or comes to the podium and says, look, we are going to defend Taiwan and its democracy, and as soon as the Chinese pull out of Taiwan and the Chinese Navy has been negated, we will seek ceasefire terms. Now, it sounds crazy. Why would you let China off the hook at that point? At that point, the Chinese Navy will be destroyed anyway. They can't really project much and cause much of a threat in the Pacific. But it's much easier to convince the Philippines, hey, this is only going to be a 3-week conflict. Jump on in. We're going to kick China's ass, and then you'll have all these concessions and rah. And if China has to pull back off Taiwan and go back, that's a defeat for China. And that's a win for the US without having to go onto the mainland. And the market will also feel much more confident. If you are saying this is an indefinite long-term war, that's going to freak a lot of people out. Anticipate that much like on 9/11, that Biden and Xi will probably shut the markets until things have stabilized. But the markets will freak out. But if it's a short war and you are telling the business community, hey, look, this is 3 weeks, probably let's call it 6 weeks to be polite. Don't panic. Don't sell everything. You're going to see US hegemony at the end. That might actually keep a lot of people more calm. And it's also the moral high ground. If you're going in saying we are just here to defend Taiwan, it's a much easier narrative to sell. And again, it's a lot about messaging in that first couple of days on who gets lots of money and support and international partners jumping in and who's willing to support and put sanctions upon China. If you come... So Biden has 2 options. He can declare what would be called a free fire zone, effectively saying, as of midnight tonight, anything in this zone is completely fair game to shoot at. And the reason you do that is, A, it makes tracking everything on satellites much easier because you can effectively just lower your parameters to any ship that moves in here, track, and we can fire upon it. But it also gives the international shipping community, a bit of clearance and to know what to do. China is obviously so packed with ships every single day of the week. There is going to be a lot of shipping companies freaking out at that moment on are they going to be fired upon? And insurance will go through the absolute roof the moment this thing kicks off unless parameters and rules of engagement are set. That will drive the price of everything up domestically. And the last thing you want Biden to do is effectively announce, hey, we're going to fire at everything and the price of insurance on ship goes up. So he has 2 options. One is this zone. That would be better for the international community because you can still have ships coming in and out of China, out of Hong Kong or out of Shanghai, and effectively still keeping trade going between China and the rest of the world. Because again, just cut China out tomorrow. That's a massive problem for a huge amount of countries, and a lot of countries will complain about it. And you want to kind of keep the shipping and then the world transport industry somewhat in the loop of what's going on. So the other option is effectively this. That would be where you are, nothing gets in and out of China because no freighter ship will want to come in and out of China. And again, you want to set it because the last thing you want to do is fire upon, let's say, a Dutch flagged ship and risk causing a hoo-ha between the US and the Dutch. If you say, hey, in 3 days' time, everything here is a free fire zone, that does give every ship that's in the region time to skedaddle and get out of there. But you are going to have massive economic problems. Whereas that model we had before, this much shorter model, you can effectively say everything within 24 hours, get out, and it makes it much easier to track satellites and a few other bits and pieces. So, part 6 of the sideshows. So, there are 2 sideshows with this conflict, and we kind of need to go through them. The first is Kinmen here, very close to the Chinese mainland, but it's part of Taiwan, and we'll go through that. And Penghu, which is very much closer to Taiwan, and also in the channel. So Kinmen is a very worrying situation, and I think we should probably do a whole episode on it, but we'll talk a bit about it a little bit right at the end. Is really low garrison. It's 2,500 men, just the 101st Recon for the Taiwanese. If China were to go take it in a Crimea-like scenario, whether it be with private military or just unmarked Chinese soldiers or whatever, the estimation is that it will fall within 8 hours. Now, if China was to take it, that would be a big escalation step up, but they could take it quite easily. Penghu, on the other hand, is a real conundrum for the Chinese military because it's quite well defended. It's got armor, it's got artillery, it's got motor rifle guys, it's got its own airfields, it's quite well stocked, And invading it and taking it is actually a real pain in the ass because of its geography as well. So you'll have some people on Navy say, hey, look, we should go take it first, because having Penghu sitting in our shipping lanes will mean that Penghu can just pick off and target ships coming across. But again, that's going to take 2+ weeks to take. And if you are thinking about how quick the US can respond, do you want to waste your 2 weeks of surprise time fighting for Penghu whilst the US are now barreling across the Pacific? So in all honesty, the most likely scenario, the PLAN will probably advocate for invasion of Penghu. The PLA, though, will probably say, we're just going to risk being shot at rather than trying to take it. They may try and take both at the same time, but again, with the problems that they have coming up, you really want to concentrate where you're fighting. So Penghu is probably just going to sit there and be a giant thorn in the side of Chinese forces coming across the channel, because taking it will delay your invasion of the mainland by 2 weeks if you're lucky, 6 if you're not, in which case the US are now barreling across the Pacific and really causing you problems. So beaches, and now we're getting into the real fun Taiwan-specific stuff. So China, by the modeling, needs to get 500,000 troops ashore to be successful in this. To actually take it, they need to do that. And that's a godforsakingly big number. And we'll go through why. Again, only those small 22 landing craft, and they can mobilize civilian fleet. But unlike, I watch way too many people talk about World War II and use it to talk, about how modern war works. And they're very different conflicts. When you talk about an amphibious invasion into Taiwan, unlike coming across the channel from Normandy, it's an 8-hour journey, and 8-hour journey with satellites. The moment these guys, whether it be the sensors and reactors that the US have just as drones sitting in the waters outside most of these ports, whether it be satellites, whether it be spies, whatever, we're going to know pretty much exactly when the Chinese fleet take off from. We're going to know from almost, a couple of minutes afterwards, let's say half an hour after landing convoys have taken off from the mainland and heading towards the appropriate beaches and say, hey, we think they're coming again. The Germans didn't know where the landings were coming and didn't know how much was coming across and all that good stuff. The Chinese will not be able to hide that very well. Even if they get very lucky and it's a very cloudy day, there are ways to get around that. Now, geography on Taiwan is painful, to say the least. You've got effectively this flat bit across the western coasts, and then you've got these just giant mountains running down the spine. Now, there are 3 invasion scenarios that we tend to go through. So let's go through the first one, which is sort of Plan North, Taipei. Now, a classic example, and the example I think I used in the live stream, was if I am having a picnic with my wife and my child in my backyard, I would pack very differently to if I'm having a picnic 3 suburbs across in a park. If I'm having it in my house, I'm not going to bring extra diapers and all this kind of stuff that you need to bring. I'm just going to bring food. Whereas if I'm packing to go a couple of suburbs across, I'm going to bring spare clothes and diapers and everything else you need. When you're doing an invasion, you need to bring ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, communications, you need to bring everything with you. And it means that you need to have so much coming across. You need hundreds of tons of supplies just to keep everyone going, which is just bonkers. You also need to know that if you are landing on a beach and you have to unload all this stuff, you're having to get this stuff out with forklifts, you don't want to be shot at while you're doing that. If you land in Taipei, and again, there's only a few spots, let's say you land at Keelung or you land somewhere around here, you're effectively landing within a really close proximity to where the best of Taiwan's forces are and massive garrisons are. That's a really difficult problem to deal with at the moment. So you're going to have all these forces coming right down upon you on day one. There's not a lot of good places to sort of land paratroops. This is where the best anti-air and anti-missile defenses are going to be. And there's ports are going to be probably the best defended. So to get the foothold and then go take a port so you can actually bring stuff ashore, not with a forklift, but big shipping containers at a time, which is it massively exponentially increases what you can bring ashore per day. Landing in the north is really, really, really difficult because you're pushing uphill from the first minute. The advantage, why you would talk about a northern landing is, but we could capture the government and we can capture Taipei and the capital. But the thing is, Ukraine didn't surrender and they were given very ambiguous offers of assistance and hope. If the US come on television and Biden goes, hey cowboys, hold off 3 days and I'm gonna be over there and punching them like corn pop. Go down that road. They're going to be willing to hold out for 2 weeks. It's it's a much easier sell to the general population going, hold for 3 weeks and help is on its way. So even if you can capture Taipei, to which you would need to build up enough forces on the beaches to go catch Taipei, it's a much harder battle. You're not going to be able to do it with the tiny garrison you can bring across on day 1 or day 2. But you're not going to be able to do that with a small garrison. And even if you take Taipei, I don't see it capitulating as easy as that. So Case North, I have seen it modeled a few times, but it's almost always dismissed as a terrible idea. Case West, effectively a Taichung landing. It actually ends up being a beach just about here or a beach down here. This is the least defended of the options. And there are port facilities in Taichung, but the trouble is you are now fighting a two-front war. And if you've got a very limited amount of troops, because you can't bring that many across easily, you lose the advantage of having massive numbers of Chinese soldiers. You now have to split your forces effectively either down, let's say, half your forces on this river and half your forces on this river, because you have troops from the north traveling south and troops from the south traveling north. You've just made this a two-front war. You're halving the amount of capacity you can push in either direction. So I just can't see it being a feasible option. I've seen it played out that effectively there's a second landing in the center here, that its entire thing is effectively as a suicide force is better way to put it. So idea of kind of we're going to land stuff right in the back area here and stop Taipei forces coming down whilst the southern forces can barrel in from the other side. Is it true? Could it work? I probably wouldn't. It seems like a waste of resources and men to me. So plan south then is the Tainan Kaohsiung plan. This is effectively the one that almost all your models fall under, the Tainan Kaohsiung plan. The idea would be that if you can land and the beaches end up being about here and one here, you can effectively try and secure a foothold in the south and use it to A, get a good port so you can bring stuff ashore. That's really important. And B, you can start to bring more and more men and build up a big enough force down south here to eventually push up the coast. Now, yes, it's the furthest march to Taipei, but you also want to be able to have secure beaches to bring your stuff ashore. You don't want your forklift drivers fired upon. Also, you can concentrate across one front. As we can see a bit better actually in this particular map, as we push up along the coast here, you really only have to get across these, this kind of small gap between the mountains and the sea. So you can concentrate down here and then push up. So build-up areas in China are likely to be Shantou, Xiamen, and Fuzhou. That's probably the spots that we'd most likely model for build-up areas. Not too important to this, but we're limited to options. So here are the only beaches in all of Taiwan that are actually suitable for naval amphibious landing invasions. Why is that? Some of it is because, as we saw with that terrain map, that the mountains are just horrifyingly big. But the main thing is a lot of the beaches down in a lot of this area are either urbanized, so you're like landing in someone's front yard, which isn't great for unloading and getting stuff off, or B, you got a lot of stuff, particularly down this area, where the ground is so smushy that you put your tank or whatever, or armored vehicle, whatever you want to put across, and it just sinks into the mud almost immediately, or you get bogged with your ships, making them sitting ducks and just making it really hard to get anything on and offshore, which only leaves us these two, effectively here and here. So our entire invasion has to focus around these two beaches. So if our three options are Case Taipei, Case Taichung, Case Kaohsiung, we're going to probably see Case Kaohsiung take the day. Now, commands. Let's go through what Taiwan's kind of military structure looks like. The 6th Army is Taiwan's best equipped, its best missile defense, its best air defense. It's where a lot of your special forces commands and whatnot are as well. It's what makes that invasion in the north just that more difficult in trying to even get a foothold. 10th is probably the least well equipped, but still decent. And 8th is the one we're going to have to worry about a bit. You have got, obviously there's a little recon guys up in Kinmen, just off here on the map, but there's are some guys on the east coast. It's a token force, simply because if you land here, great, you gotta go all the way around the island, and you now need to get over the mountains, which is quite painful. So multiple landings is tough. Again, you want to go and split your forces. If you are requiring all this energy and men and equipment to get ashore, do you really want to split that across two and split your air cover into, split your naval cover into, Yeah, not a good option. So as we went through the 3 options, I hope by now from my descriptions here, you would also decide south is the best option. So day 1, look at that. So our options are limited and we're just going to stick with Kaohsiung. Plan K, we'll call it. So the plan K would be take Kaohsiung, take a foothold that you can bring stuff ashore safely and take the port at Kaohsiung. Use that to bring in lots more men that you can then push in, and then you can take Tainan, then you push up and take Taichung, then you take up Taipei, and hopefully then you capitulate the island before the US. That is plan K. Is it going to work? We'll see. So day 1, Kaohsiung. Let's take a look at what we're up against. If we're China, obviously. So this is the 8th Army. Obviously they got the 564th Armoured, the 333rd Motor Rifles, 203rd Infantry, the 43rd Artillery, the 75th Signals. We got a Sappers group for the 54th, and we got a 39th Chem Warfare guys. They probably won't be hugely involved in this particular conundrum, but they can obviously help in certain ways. But you can see here that we're not fighting a small force. This is just what's sitting in the south, ready to go this afternoon, let alone what we can mobilize or what we can bring down from the north, which is why that point we talked about earlier on, effectively going through why Taiwan doesn't need to mobilize. If you've already got this down south, let alone bringing stuff from up north back down, that's a pretty decent force to fight the small amount of men that China can really bring ashore. The goals down here, what China will be aiming to get are the 7th Air Wing, the Kaohsiung Port, the Kaohsiung International Airport, the Zhuyin Civilian Port, which is just north of the city, the 5th Air Wing, just south of Tainan, the Tainan Civilian Airport, the Tainan Civilian Port. These are your main aims. And why that's important is if you're a soldier, you burn through your ammunition super quick. Soldiers in firefights will burn through most of their ammunition in like 7 minutes of real firefighting. So the problem is now that if a soldier runs out of ammunition, he stops being a soldier and he becomes a badly dressed tourist. So if you are desperate to try and bring stuff ashore, the amount you can bring ashore a day when you're trying to unload out of a forklift onto a beach is just woefully low. If you're bringing stuff ashore, once you have a port and you can, much like just regular day shipping, just shipping container stuff off, that's huge. That's a massive advantage. Taking airfields is great because you could operate more helicopters locally is a thought, but you could also use them to launch sorties your own. You could also land airplanes to effectively unload gear from the airports. Okay, so we're an hour and a bit into this stream, and we're finally getting into the actual day 1 fighting. So let's talk about the southern plain here, and here's Kaohsiung, effectively the landings we were talking about earlier on. And obviously here's our big objectives: Kaohsiung Port, Kaohsiung Civilian, the International Airport, and the 7th Air Wing. And here's where 8th Army's headquarters are. So let's say for the sake of the argument, we're going to land some paratroopers in, and we'll go to a satellite photo afterwards because that will kind of show why the problem is. But there's not actually a lot of spots you can land airborne troops if you're China. And Beijing probably won't want to commit them into the field unless they really have to, because most airborne troops for a lot of authoritarian regimes are effectively kept there to guard the palace's rapid response forces if there's ever any problems back home. And at this point, we're expecting there to be problems back home. But let's say for the sake of the argument, we get the airborne troops down. There's actually not a lot of spots to land airborne forces south here in Kaohsiung, because again, we got to get somewhere we can land. We're not getting immediately shot at, and we can regroup and go for there. But again, our day 1 objectives are going to be trying to capture an airfield or a port or something of that variety. These 2 beaches here are effectively the spots where you can land. The spot in here is effectively very urbanized. It's a very, very small beach, but it is quite close to the port. But what you can bring ashore is really, really minimal. The spots down here are a little less crowded. They're actually not a bad spot to land, all things said and considered. But again, we've got to get off this beach and across these bridges, hoping to God that they don't get cut before we get there. And then we've got to get across here and try and get across one of these bridges to get into Kaohsiung and the really important stuff. This is a big ask. I'm going to use Ukraine as an example one more time. It's really hard to take an airfield with just airborne forces. They're not heavily armed. It becomes really difficult to effectively fight tanks and fight armor if they come across you. But also the fact that securing a usable airfield is difficult. I mean, the Ukrainians saw the Russians coming and just parked a whole bunch of trucks and vehicles across the tarmac and effectively took the keys and walked away with them. And what happened is it makes it really difficult to effectively land troops, land planes. And that's the whole point of taking this airfield. You want to try and take the airfield so you can get planes on the ground, you can unload with gear. If that's how easy it is to deny an airfield, it's going to be pretty difficult for the airborne troops to get in there, surrounded, fight with very little equipment and supply and everything with them, and try and take an airfield, secure it, hold it long enough that you can start using it to bring more troops in. But let's be generous. Getting ashore is much more difficult than this. They're going to be shot at coming past Penghu. They're going to be shot at by anti-ship missiles, particularly if the US have given a lot of them over the time. They're going to be a lot of sea mines in a lot of the approaches will be activated. A lot of them will sit there dormant at the moment, but will be activated in the time of war. So you're going to lose an absolute buttload of men trying this operation. The aims is to try and take all this in the first day. I think that's nearly impossible. In fact, most modeling would show that they can't even get past this stage. They won't even get to taking Kaohsiung or taking a port. But we're going to be generous. I don't want to be that guy that kind of just says, oh, look, it's impossible. Let's be generous. If you can't tell, I liked the show Mythbusters growing up, where they'll go and test the theory, and then they'll push a little bit further, put the thumb on the scale and see, even in the worst case scenario, what does the reality look like here? And that's what we'll kind of do a bit of today. This is your best case scenario, that the forces on the ground for Taiwan were caught off by surprise, and you managed to take the 7th Air Wing, you managed to take Kaohsiung's airport, and you managed to take Kaohsiung's civilian port. That would get you a huge amount of capacity to bring more supplies ashore using the actual port. And you could land more planes on the ground. That is a possibility, but we've just seen from the war in Ukraine that anti-air defense is cheap and really effective. And getting planes across is actually much more dangerous than what a lot of people assumed it would be. That's why Russia's been really hesitant to use its air force. So you would imagine that whatever's coming across the channel plane-wise is going to be just chewed up and spat out a lot quicker than a lot of people hoped. And again, because it's a plane, you're just burning through your experienced crews doing so. The guys that maybe were good enough to get through one supply run and they managed to fly low enough and do what they need to do, they'll survive. But if they get shot in the second or third run, then by the time you get to your 5th to 6th to 7th, you're using green crews who are having an even higher chance of being shot down. And again, we have a model for this, and we can go through that. We're going to go through that in a bit. So here's what it looks like on a satellite map. You can just see that this whole area is urban fighting, and urban fighting is a pain in the ass. As we saw with Grozny, as we're seeing in the Gaza Strip at the moment, urban warfare is slow, tedious, and monotonous fighting. And again, you're going to have to try and get across a few rivers here. Again, I would be shocked if with 8 hours warning that the Taiwanese military doesn't blow these bridges, knowing that, hey, these ships have a bearing heading towards the south. That probably suggests they're going to go for Kaohsiung. Okay, well, if they're landing at Kaohsiung, there's only 2 options. Let's start blowing the bridges, so it makes it really difficult to get from these southern beaches up to here. Again, we'll give the benefit of the doubt, the thumb on the scale, and say that they don't blow the bridges, but in reality, amphibious warfare is difficult. Even getting across rivers is really difficult. It's the picnic problem again, that if I'm going to cross the river, I can't cross with tanks and have easy retreat points. I have to cross the river with my men, my supplies, my communications, my fuel, my meds, everything I need to come across the river with, and be able to set up a beachhead across the river whilst my enemy is likely to use a counterattack and try and push me back into the river. If we're looking at this, these Chinese forces have to effectively go and land somewhere in the south here and then cross 1-2 rivers and then go fight an urban conflict with bugger all supplies coming ashore. They're not getting lots and lots of men and tanks either. Effectively, if you've got a limited number of boats coming across and you then have a choice of, do I fill this boat with 1 tank, and that's great, and I bring the fuel that I need for it and whatnot, or can I bring 20 men ashore? And that's a really tough bargain to make. So again, this is a huge limiting problem, and we'll see it in the modeling going forward. So again, the aim for China is going to be take an airfield to maintain air superiority. Now, if we're going with case 4, which is what we kind of modeled here, then yes, they probably would have air superiority on day one. The Taiwanese Air Force is not particularly strong. A lot of it actually does sit in mounted bunkers, so some of it will probably survive. But the Chinese Air Force is not anything to sneeze at. But securing a beachhead, secure a port, and even if you get that port, fight for Kaohsiung. And again, that's a massive urban city, in which case, I can't remember almost any time that a force was able to take on an urban fight and effectively win it in a day. And again, time frame is going to be ticking. Now, Taiwan is, you're going to have to maintain government. This is a big one, and this is one of the inflection points of Ukraine that, the whole model changes. Let's say if Taiwan was to be struck by the massive missile strikes that we anticipate on day one, that they lose the majority of cabinet, some event, some Christmas party or something, where they get the majority of cabinet, then there's a possibility of another government coming into place that says, hey, look, let's surrender, or something different. Maintaining government will be incredibly important in this point. And also just keeping people motivated to get in the fight. Maintaining your command, making sure that they're talking with the allies and going down that way. Securing allies, we're not particularly worried about a landing in Tainan or landing anywhere in even Taipei. It's still very important to keep your population calm, and you might be running whatever you need to run to keep them happy and make sure you're prepared at least for a second invasion, just in case. Then you have to kind of decide whether you want to fight on the beaches, effectively try and push the small garrison of Chinese that will be there on day one back into the sea, which is probably a good objective. Frankly, if they've only got a handful of men, some paratroopers through the city, no armor ashore yet, that's probably a doable objective. Whether you want to effectively, you can fight them in the cities, just slow them down through the cities so that you can effectively hold off until the Americans get there, or you could pull back into the rivers and hills and try and fight out there. I would probably imagine that it's probably one of the first two. If they have the armor ready to go, they might go for the beaches, but pulling back into the cities is probably not a bad idea. Going down to the beaches means you have to bring a supply chain with you. And right now, we can imagine that after those first massive strikes of missiles and with the roads from the south to the north of the country, because it is just lots of effectively highways going from north to south, will be just packed with refugees. A lot of southerners trying to get out of the area, a lot of just random people trying to get out. It'll be chaos. So you're probably better to, if you're a commander in the 8th Army down south, going, okay, let's back ourselves in Kaohsiung. It gives us a chance to stay pretty well supplied. We can hold there a bit better and a bit more reasonable, and also make sure there's not looting and just absolute chaos in the southern cities there. And do you want to redeploy? At that point, you might be thinking, okay, do I want to take some of the guys I have in the middle of the country and chuck them down south, or keep them in the middle of the country so we can keep law and order, keep the traffic flowing a bit better, and also protect against any second invasion if that's going down? Again, we're going to be generous to the Chinese and say, hey, look, I think you guys can get some ground on day one. I personally don't think that's the case. A lot of the modeling and a lot of the war games don't think that's the case, because we're going to just lose a lot of men to sea mines and anti-ship missiles and whatnot. But also the fact that last time China fought a war, apart from small skirmishes with the Indians, effectively hand-to-hand throwing rocks at each other, was against Vietnam, and they lost. The Chinese military is not particularly well trained for these sort of things, and an amphibious operation is probably the most complex operation an army could ever undertake. So we're asking a, frankly, fairly green army to take on a very difficult operation against an entrenched, defensively trained military with terrible supply lines and problems. Again, in reality, even if you, let's say, have 20 ships worth of supplies coming across and the Taiwanese defenders only shoot down 4 of them, which I think is a low number. If you've hit the one that contained the fuel, for instance, great, now none of your vehicles work. There's a reason that Ukraine, very early in the conflict, effectively targeted Russia's fuel trucks as almost top priority, because the tanks just can't roll when there's no fuel. And even if they want to try and fill up at local gas stations, the moment a Chinese tank gets anywhere near a gas station, they'll blow the gas station. So air power. So I'm not going to go into exact numbers. I think that's a much longer talk, and we've already been here for a long time. But let's talk about effectively dividing the battlefield here up into 6 sections. China, the Taiwan Strait, Taiwan itself, the West Pacific, Central Pacific, and the United States. Effectively, let's call it Pearl Harbor out to San Diego. So China could effectively push right out into the Central Pacific. That's possible. They have some aerial refuelers. They have their aircraft carrier they can use to effectively do this. But at that point, you're so far out that only your best planes can really operate out that far. And you've got no missile cover coming out there. Your sortie rate is going to be right down because you've got to fly all the way back to wherever you're taking off from. You're not going to have the concentration of planes. Pushing out this far, the best analogy I can probably think of here is, imagine 2 buckets. Now, if you concentrate around Taiwan Strait area, maybe the hole in the bottom of the bucket is a centimeter or an inch across. You're losing lots of troops, but it's just kind of drip to drip. If you're out in the Central Pacific, you are having, let's say, 3 or 4 holes in that bucket. You'll lose your daily grind of planes and equipment just higher and higher every day. And you're just going to chew through your fleet much quicker. It does give an advantage that effectively, you're keeping the US further away from Taiwan. Because if you're, let's say, worried about your carriers being attacked, or you're worried about some of your facilities being attacked, you may, as the US, decide that you want to play a little bit safer. You want to wait till your convoys are more gathered up. You want to get your screening guys in place. You want to kind of get more of the US military in position, or Navy in position, and gather your numbers before you start pushing across the Pacific and start fighting these Chinese planes in the central. Now, you may have bought yourself another week or another 4 or 5 days while the US Navy gets its shit together. But you've lost you've lost all your best planes doing operations where they frankly could probably be better used. The more likely scenario is something more like this, where they're concentrating mostly over Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait, either trying to attack submarines or allied submarines sitting in the strait, or even though that strait's quite shallow, which makes it much more difficult for submarines to operate in that particular water. So you're mostly trying to keep your troops in the beachhead, the ones down in Kaohsiung, supported. Also trying to make sure you can knock out as much of the Taiwanese military on the ground. The trouble with concentrating, whilst it's more effective for keeping Taiwan effectively contained and that campaign cracking along, is that you just cede the entire Pacific to the US effectively. And they more quickly are able to just travel across the Pacific and then engage you over Taiwan. And when the US are engaging China, they're not probably going to win that fight. And that gets real problematic real quick. And again, you could then go, okay, well, maybe I have a lot more missile cover from my numerous short-range cruise missiles if I pull back into the Taiwan Strait, where the US bucket, if we use a bucket analogy again, will have much more holes in it. The US are going to lose more planes the further they push towards Taiwan than they will in any other place. So the US will probably want to just keep themselves covered over the sort of Taiwan itself, and then push over into the Taiwan Strait, and then probably avoid the mainland if they can avoid it. Again, we set that parameter right in the start of our rules of engagement and whether the US would strike the mainland. And I think that there is a lot of modeling around whether the US is willing to strike missile batteries or airfields that are conducting operations in Taiwan. That's a possibility. I think that's something the US could do. But I think if Biden is very sure about a victory in this campaign, he may just not want to strike the mainland for the same kind of reasons they wouldn't want to strike the mainland during the Korean War in the 50s. Not to antagonize and not to try and escalate it. You want to keep this to a Taiwan war, because if you keep it to a Taiwan war, effectively then you're probably going to win that, and it allows you to effectively have a much shorter, sharper, much more politically palatable war. And if Biden can knock out all the Chinese, effectively Navy and Air Force, or most of them operating in this theater in 3 weeks, and get a Chinese piece of paper and a peace deal with Xi, that's hugely politically, that's a guaranteed 50 points of approval at that point. Let's talk Navy. Now, Navy is actually in a really similar position. If China wants to try and operate this far out into the Pacific, let's say they just run the gauntlet and they want to go really sit out here, it's doable. Technically it's on the cards. I think it's a dumb idea though, because of the fact they are going to be out of range of all the sort of coastal batteries and coastal missile sites and air power and all the things that China would love and really probably need to have to keep their Navy safe, which really only actually works in this really small area here. So they may just choose to operate down here, but that also leaves problems of, do you really want to use that much of the Chinese Navy to keep the South China Sea operating effectively as a friendly Chinese lake? Or do you want to keep pulling your men back from the Navy just to the strait and the direct surrounding areas, which you will need to do to keep those convoys secure, because otherwise the convoys are going to be under attack by more planes and more submarines and more all the good stuff. But now you've just ceded the South China Sea. And this is a sort of a question that comes up later on is, well, if that's the case, does the US use this opportunity to take Flying Cross Reef and a few of these bases in the South China Sea back? Supply. Spreadsheet time. This is my favorite bit of anything. I am a bit of a spreadsheet nerd, and I have this spreadsheet I have designed beforehand. It's based on a much more complex military model. But what we've done is we've really just broken it down into some really basic round numbers because I want everyone to be able to grip around their heads on what the problem is and what the parameters are, even if we're just modeling really simple ways. So ships deployed, that's how many ships we're going to put across the channel. We're going to suggest that every troop burns through 10 units of supply, generic supply. Our troops, we're going to put just every troop is, let's say, a battalion size group. Planes deployed, that's the amount of planes you want to be using to keep supply going. Troops deployed, that's the amount of troops you want to put ashore that day. And effectively, this is how much you're expecting to lose in the operation. So on day one, we're losing 20% of what, all the ships that come across the Taiwan Strait at 30% of the planes. Now, this is like laughably low as a number, but I kind of want to give China the benefit of the doubt, the best case scenario. Otherwise, we run out of resources way too quick. I want to give them a bit of a fighting chance to demonstrate what the problem is here. Now, I've got a nice graph and everything down here, but I don't want to give away too much of the story here. So effectively, I'll go through a bit of that later, but this is effectively the model we just need to understand. So we can see here that let's say we're bringing 20 ships, 6 of them are going to have troops inside, so we can have supplies in the other whole bunch of ships, so 140 supplies ashore. We're burning through 60 supply. Let's say every troop on shore now burns through 10 units of supply, which is fairly reasonable. You're actually burning through a huge amount of supplies every single day you crack through this. We've net change from the day before was kind of 5 extra soldiers have come ashore because we lost 1 on day 1. I again think that's ridiculously low, but we're going to give China a really good start. And so EOD troops, again, the end of day troops. So 11:59, 59 seconds, 5 troops ashore, 80 supply ashore, because that's what's left out of our garrison here. So we've given them 450 ships, which I think is generous as well, but whatever. And then 284 transport planes, which is pretty close to what China has. And we'll give them 100 battalions to play around with. Although, the manpower won't be the problem here, as we'll come across later. So let's go and now go day 2. So day 2, we're still limited to 20 ships because, again, when we get on this beach, we are trying to unload on a beach. Imagine driving your car out of the water onto the beach and then trying to forklift things out of the car every day. We are stuck at that 20. But we still want to bring troops ashore. So we bring another 6. We're desperately trying to get those numbers up. We probably need 15 troops to go take Kaohsiung port. We need a good offensive run because, again, you got to bring not just the guys firing the guns, but you got to bring the medics and the cooks and everything else with them as well, because you're fighting a war on the island. So we've now got 9 troops ashore, which, again, great. We're building up our troops, but we're now burning 110 supplies a day versus 60 the day before. We lost 2 troops as well. That's fine. EOD supplies. We're still building up a good chunk of supply. But now you see day 2, we're losing a little more planes coming across. Not a problem yet. Nothing to worry about. So day 3 is if we were to, let's say, bring across the same amount of planes, and this is where it starts to really kick in. So let's say for the sake of the argument, we're now in day 3, we want to bring across more planes because we're now hitting this problem here that, we had 88 supplies on shore. We know we're going to burn through 110 a day. We've got to keep bringing supply across. Planes get a little more expensive because we're now losing more as they come across. But, if we were to just bring across, let's say 15, this is the problem we have here, the EOD supplies. Now, if we run out of supplies, they run out of bullets. And again, this is a really simple model because it's just generic supply. Yes, we run out of bullets. Congrats, you now have your troops turn from elite soldiers into effectively poorly dressed tourists. So they can't fight a war if they don't have any bullets in the gun. And if we fire 15 planes across, we're now net losing 72 supply units per day, which then means that we've effectively got enough supplies to probably see us through to, lunchtime the day after. So we don't really want to. We know we're losing 40% of every plane, all the planes we send across, including the crews, but we've got to up it to 45 just to effectively get it to a point where we can make it through the day. But even then, we're now losing net supply. So that's not a good place to be. So we'll tackle it tomorrow. We're pretty close to getting that port. But until we get a port, our ships are limited to 20 a day. That's the hard ceiling. We can't up the amount of ships until we get a port. And that's really going to hurt for this. Now let's get to day 4. So we got to day 4 now, and we are having to put 60 planes across now just to keep supply, just to keep EOD from ticking below. If we were to go, let's say 45, keep that same amount of plates, yet we're really risking this number falling below the number it needs to. So we've had to put 60 across. If we were to actually go and do enough to keep a net supply gain, let's say put 150 planes across. Yeah, we can do it, but we're now burning through, 90 planes a day, which if we've got 82 left, if we do that, it's just unsustainable. So let's put it 60 so we have somewhat sustainable amount of planes left. And again, what I want to kind of show with this model is there's not any huge battles or casualties or massive oh, what a great move by either side. This is just slow, understandable attrition that ends up being the problem, and economics effectively kills the invasion. I don't think they get the port personally, but let's model that they do because we're being polite to the Chinese here. Day 5, port. Now, even if you capture the port, you're not going to be able to immediately use it on day 1. You're going to have to bring in engineers to effectively get it fixed. So we're still capped to 20 today. We can raise it a bit tomorrow. But again, just to keep those 15 troops up, we've had to effectively decide to, we put 6, 6, and 8 across last day 3. We're having to limit it to bringing just 3 across a day, because if we were to actually bring, let's say, 8 across on day 4, congrats, we're now hitting, as you can see on the back here, we're immediately running out of supply. So we can't even bring across lots of troops, because the more troops we have on shore, the more supplies they burn through. Obviously more mouths to feed, more guns to fill, more people to get there. Usually you can solve this as well by, if let's say you're the Russians case in Ukraine, you can effectively stop your offensive, spend a couple days not bringing much troops in, but bringing lots of supplies in, and build up a nice little nest egg in your end of day supplies. Great, but again, we're fighting to get past the 3-week point, where we are a race against the clock, so we cannot take time to stop and replenish and build up nest eggs of supplies. So the only way we can effectively keep a net supplies coming in is we've upped our planes to 100 a day. We've lost 80 or 60 planes today just coming across the channel. We've only put another 3, effectively almost just replacing our losses effectively. And now we're down to 130 planes in our total arsenal. If at this point, as we'll go through, if we hadn't taken a port, the war would probably be over, because if we're limited to another day of 20, we've only got probably 1 day left of, as you can see, EOD, transport planes remaining, of this amount of planes to keep up, to be able to supplement and fill the gaps that not being able to up our ships amount does. Because again, until we get a port, we can't bring up the amount of ships we bring that can land ashore. So let's go to day 6. So the port is somewhat working. We've got at least a couple of berths going. Congratulations, nice work. We can immediately then drop the amount of planes we're sending across per day, because we want some left for future operations or just to do anything. So we'll want to drop the planes as soon as we possibly can without compromising the front itself. We're only bringing 1 troop across because, again, we're just desperate to try and not run out of supplies. And more troops we put across, the more problems we're going to have. So we're also seeing these numbers tick up. So we're now at 30% of ships coming across will be lost. This is when the first US subs have started really creeping in the area. We're starting to see the Taiwanese get better at targeting with their anti-ship missiles. We're probably seeing the very first US planes might be starting to rock up. And we're starting to see the anti-aircraft batteries, the ones that survived the first missile strikes, effectively starting to really pump up. We're losing 70% of planes we have come across, which is why you want to drop this number as quick as possible while still maintaining supply. But we're burning through 160 supplies a day. We're bringing across more than that though, because we're so little troops, more ships, and for the first time in a while, we're starting to build a nice supply nest egg effectively for what might be useful later on. So we got 14 supplies on shore and 116. Now we'd probably need 25, 30-ish troops to go, actually have a chance of getting a good offensive underway. But if we don't bring any supply ashore and we're bringing 30 troops across, congrats, we are bankrupt on the next day. So it's a much more difficult problem to try and solve. So let's go day 7. So we can up it now that we get more of the port working. We can up the amount of ships. We're trying to pull back the amount of planes we're using. And again, we're not trying to bring a lot of troops ashore, because these two numbers here, effectively the 30% of ships you got coming across, which again I think is just ridiculously low, and the 70% of planes you got coming across is only going to get higher. Would you rather bring across supply now while you're losing 30% of what you have across the channel, or bring across supply later when you're at the point of, where it's 80, 90% losses? If you can buy the concept here, possibly build a bit of enough of a nest egg of supplies on the island, you might have a shot of, let's say if the US have completely captured the air, but Taiwan was 1 day away from surrender, you might buy that extra day to carry it out. So again, you can just see these number of ships just ticking up. The amount of planes is starting to tick down because we're just lowering the amount of planes. And the amount of supply we have is pretty bad as well. And we've actually lost the amount of troops on Taiwan at this point, but our supplies are pretty rapidly growing, which is fantastic. So now let's get to day 8. And again, I'm pretty sure they don't actually get a port, but take the argument, let's say they do. Day 8, the port is now fully working. We have a capacity of 50 ships a day now. We've over doubled our capacity, which is fantastic. We can really start bringing some troops and ships across. We can actually, we can see here where we started to actually not only build up surplus, but we're starting to actually up our troop numbers again. We're lowering the amount of planes we're using again. We really don't want to bring in any more across than we need to. But we're net supply change. We've added an extra 100 at the end of the day, 118 more supply than what we went in with. And we've added more troops as well. This is starting to look good for China. There's a possibility. We're all very pumped at the moment. The next day, we're bringing 50 ships across a day again. Fantastic. We're dropping the amount of planes again because we're just running low. We're using 20 planes today. And after our losses today, we're going to have 18 planes remaining in the entire Chinese arsenal. You can just see that because of this war, we're losing planes, a really disgusting amount of planes, but we have no other choice other than to fly them in. Because, if you are burning through, let's say 10 supply a day, and you shoot half of whatever comes across the channel, if you only send those 10 planes, then great. You now have only 5 supplies for your troops. They can't fight. They can't win the war. They lose the battle. So you have to then send 20 double down, knowing that half of them will get shot down. But in the end, you end up with the 10 supply that makes it ashore. It's a exponentially bad problem. And this is, as you can see with the modeling, even if we wanted to not throw all our planes at a horrifyingly bad situation, we just don't have a choice. We have to keep, the moment this EOD number drops to 0, the stockpiles are empty and we lose the war. I mean, frankly, even getting down towards your 30s, you'd probably be considering a surrender anyway, because you probably want to surrender while there's still some bullets left in your gun, but we're not going to go down that road. So let's be even more generous to the Chinese. Let's say they take a second port so they can do even more shipping across. Probably the one, south of Tainan. This is very generous. We're starting to bring a lot of ships across, but the US planes are starting to rock up. We're starting to lose 40% rather than 30% of our ships coming across. Again, I think the number should be far higher. And, we've got 450. We've already lost 100 of those ships. It's not a huge amount of ships lost, but still enough that it's annoying. We're also down to 11 transport planes. We're effectively having to pretty much give up our hopes of using transport planes as supply now, because we've burnt through almost all of our supply planes at this point. But we got 17 troops. We're starting to build up. We're having net supply every time. As a gain, we're net gaining troops. This is a good place to be in. But now the US planes rock up. We're losing 90% of whatever we have flying across and 50% of shipping. And that's just going to start to bite a little bit harder. So, now we're using our last 10 planes to try and keep some supply going, and we're down to 2 planes by the end of today. So we put 4 troops aside. We're just trying to creep up to the 25 number, but we can't just do it all at once. If we were to go, let's add 4 to 18, let's add 7 here. So 11, that already we're starting to hit the net supply loss, and you don't want to be hitting that. You want to be building up a nice nest egg rather than doing it. We can get our 25 troops across, but do you want to start where supply gets harder that early? We'll go through the graph and it will show why it's a bit of a pain. So let's go to day 12, and you'll start to see a pattern emerge that, now everything that comes across is gone, but we don't send any planes anyway. We can start having 70 soldiers, 70 ships across because we have 2 ports operational. Yeah, it's fantastical. But the morbid thing about this is the fact that the less troops you have on shore, the easier it is to supply. When we have 18 were burning through more supply than you are with 17. So more troops on the island is required and necessary if you want to take the island, but it's also a massive burden on the supplies you have there. So you're going to be desperate. We've built up 629 supply. Fantastic. That looks like multiple days worth of supply. We're doing well. So, now we're starting to prioritize. We got a nice little nest egg. The US Navy and Air Force is starting to be a bit more harassing, but we're trying to get some more men across. Now the time is we're probably at Tainan. We're trying to get more and more men into the fight. And you can see here we're getting more men up, but our net supply chain is starting to curve off. It's starting to become a bit problematic because we're burning through, we're bringing 290 supply a day, which is nearly a record, but we're also just losing more supply than we had at any other point. 70 supply again, trying to bring some more stuff, no planes again, and that net supply change is starting to curve off, starting to flatten off. We're losing more and more supply. Now, at this point, you'll be trying to barrel as many troops as fast as you can, but you're losing more men to, US airstrikes, to missile strikes, to all sorts of stuff. And you're watching this number here creep up. So this is now at 60%. And again, you get that problem of if you just keep sending the same amount of troops, you may limit the amount of losses and churn you have of boats every day, but you're not going to keep the amount of supply you need to keep everyone actually firing guns. So you're going to have to keep upping it. And again, this is the first day we're starting to see net supply change. We are now eating into, this is the top of our nest egg is probably 719 on day 13 or whatever it is. Now we are going to effectively know that if we up our troops or unless we lose troops, we're going to be effectively lowering that or living off our savings. Day 16, this is not an unusual place to be in, that we're starting to the US control the sky. And you're going to start losing 70% of what you have coming across. And we're just seeing that number. I didn't want to model it as a massive tick up. I just want to show that even in the best case scenario where it is just a slow, monotonous drum, it still goes really badly. And now we are 60 and we're losing 70%. We have to try and put 5 across because we're down to 132 ships from 450. Just a few days ago, we were sitting at like 406. And now we're down to 132 because we're sending a lot more ships across the channel, but we're also losing a lot more ships. And we're losing 140 supplies a day. That's a massive drop between that day. And we can just see the next, go 2 days down, that we're having the same problems. We're effectively, holy shit, we're losing so many ships. We now need to effectively either double down or, we're just bleeding more and more ships, more and more supply. Our supply is dropping. Eventually we've only got 60 ships left, and we need to think about, okay, what do we do? Do we start pulling men out? What do we do? Do we keep, if we want to try and get it up to 25, we're going to go bankrupt even faster. I think you can just see the problems we reach, and we reach day 21. Now, this is the big graph to understand more than anything. This is effectively what we have here in our model, the supplies on island. So this yellow line is our EOD supplies. This is the most important line out of all of them. Where it dips here, this is 0. That's when you run out of supplies. Right now, we're day 21, they ran out of supplies. And then you can just see that even if we up the model, let's say if we try and bring, as soon as we open that extra port, so here, 50, let's bring ashore, how many do we need? We need 16, so let's bring ashore another 9 troops, so 15 troops. Like, you can just see that we don't actually build that any sort of a nest egg up, and we bankrupt ourselves way earlier in the conflict, actually day 14. That's just by bringing the amount of men ashore that we would actually need to probably have any chance of fighting. Okay, so what if we managed to, rather than having this slow taper off, let's say for the sake of the argument, we wanted to try and bring all 25 troops we need. We open our second port, let's go straight for it, let's check every man we can possibly think of ashore. So 17 is what we have currently in this model. Let's add another 8 troops, so let's bring across 12 that day. Yep, we bankrupt ourselves even quicker. Okay, well, what if we tuck every ship we have? Let's put 200 ships across, so effectively burning. You can just see that even if we put 200 boats across, which is just unfathomable, unusable, not possible, we still managed to build a huge supply dump on that day. Great, 806 change. But we just, because of the troops on shore, were just bleeding more and more every day. And we end up bankrupting, pretty much where we were going to do it anyway. And I'm happy to, let people play around with this model. But effectively, it should demonstrate to most people that it doesn't matter what you do, whether you want to be the best general or the worst general, the supplies are the real killer, because this will tick up even faster than it should. Let's say if we actually model some reality where, we're losing 60% of ships per day. We are, let's say, 60% of ships per day. Sorry, I think the model should kick him out here. 0.6. We dip below our 0 point the next day. That's the reality of it, is that we're just going to dip below this yellow because it's just so difficult to bring supply ashore. We get pretty close here. And if they don't take the port, on the day 2 or 3, well, game over, kids. So all you should be taking away from this model is that there aren't any huge battles. There aren't any huge offensives here. It's just slow, detrimental burning of supplies. And it just ticks up and up and up and up. The ships lost, they are just kind of like 4, 6, 6, 9. And then it really starts kicking in as you put more ships in, going to 35, 42 a day. It's really difficult. And this graph, should pretty much show you everything you need to know is in that yellow line, is that even whatever you do, it's going to dip below that 0 at some point, even in the best modeling I could possibly get out of this, the 0 dips about somewhere around here. Okay, let's get back here. So, stuck. So this is the trouble with playing. If we get stuck at Tainan and we're starting to run out of supply, what do you do? Because if you keep fighting, you are going to effectively have a bunch of hostages. They're going to run out of ammunition and run out of everything they need. And now you have a giant set of soldiers on Taiwan that you can auction back to China for a better deal, which is not a great place to be. And again, this may be added pressure of, if you're already losing in Taiwan and this is looking real bad, and the US start maybe looking at taking Firecross Reef and undoing effectively a decade and a half of progress in the South China Sea, building bases, building facilities, building everything else, you may decide to cut your losses there and end the Taiwan War. Because you just know, if you're looking at that modeling, you just know, hey, we're not going to have enough supply on shore to be able to survive what's coming at us in a few days. We need to probably think about evacuating now. So retreat. Again, here's the graph we had before. When should China look to make a deal? Here is a really risky spot. Now, China probably doesn't want to do that. You don't want to have an entire war last 3 days, but it's not out of the question either. If a few things go Taiwan's way, then we dip below the 0. Here, as soon as that started to level off, to anyone who's familiar with military logistics, and obviously when the models get much more complex in reality, but you just know that that's it. There's no chance of you winning this. You are exponentially losing supplies coming across the channel. It's going to get worse and worse every day. And if you're here and maybe you've got like one city the island feels like it's on the brink of capitulation, maybe. But as you went through, if you're lucky to get out of Kaohsiung, you're lucky to get into Tainan. And if you get Tainan, then great, you have to march up the entire island down lots of single option highways. And you're just going to burn through supplies. Watching how quick it is, it's an even sharper decline if your troops survive. Effectively, it only gets this angle. The angle it has is because a lot of troops are dying in this point. Yeah, and it gets even worse when you start modeling for things like fuel. So fallout. What happens after this conflict? China's probably going to lose somewhere around 125,000 soldiers, probably a lot more across their navy and merchant fleets. But let's be polite. And most of the Chinese Air Force is going to be destroyed. Again, we had the US Air Force is nothing to sneeze at, and over the radar warfighting capacity is really good these days. There's a lot of Chinese planes that are just not going to last nearly that long. Your J-20s, that kind of stuff, will probably be a bit better, but some of the really old Chinese kit, some of your sort of SU, some of your J-7s, those are what China has in larger figures, but they're just not going to be good for fighting any sort of long-term conflict or going up against the 22 or 35. So you're just going to lose a huge amount of, what took China decades to build up is going to be lost in a couple of days to buy themselves enough time to not have to fight the US. And this is all depend on how much they can get on the first day as well. US losses are going to be probably around 20,000. Even at this, they don't have to, this model doesn't have the US actually getting anyone ashore. I mean, most of the models suggest that if the US try to fly Marines on day 1 or 2, they actually lose most of the Marines doing so if they want to go down that road. Most of these losses will come from day 1, from those carriers being hit by surprise, from Guam being hit, from all those places. Once we've got our naval screening ships in place, once we're actually traveling in large naval convoys, our carriers are assembled in fleets, we're probably bringing in other fleets from other places as well at this point. It's much harder to attack that fleet because you've got protection built in. So, the US are only losing pilots that are flying over Taiwan, as well as what can get through the screens in the convoys and carrier groups. But, if we're losing 2 carriers, that's a huge amount of men right there and there on day 1. So it's still going to be a devastating war, but it's one that you'll have a massive spike on day 1 and then probably a very quickly diminishing number from there. Taiwan losses are really much harder to model. That's why I haven't put it in here. Because of the fact you just don't know how many people are going to be killed in the panic or are going to be killed by the missiles, or how many, or what tactics they're going to use. I think, I don't want to be that armchair general guy who's moving the pieces around the board and, but this general made a brilliant move here. We're talking the economic and logistical modeling here. So that kind of brings us towards the end of our workshop here, but I want to answer the questions of how could China possibly win this thing? Because there are actually some models where China can win. It's very specific models, but I think we should go through them. So, 1, the US never enters the war. Most of your war games and modeling suggest that if the US does not enter this conflict, that's the game. Done, out, end. Because A, the Taiwanese are much more likely to capitulate if they don't think the US are coming down the road, and they don't get the air power, they don't see that number of ships ticking across the channel go up and continue to go up. So it is possible for China to sort of take a foothold in the south and then push up from there. I would be shocked to see the US not enter the war. I think even if it were Trump in position of power, the entire defense apparatus would probably say, hey, look, this is, you'll win a bunch of electoral points, people will be happy with you, and we can knock the Chinese Navy out once and for all. In fact, we set them back 20 years. Number 2 is I'm going to show my, I'm a classic white guy. I love Lord of the Rings. The Denethor scenario is number 2. Now, this is effectively there's a panic in Taipei, and they, flee for your lives. If you haven't seen the movie, effectively, when the orcs of Mordor rock up, Denethor panics, and he's the steward of Gondor, the kind of the temporary king, best way to put it. Tells all the soldiers to flee, abandon garrisons, give up. In the end, Gandalf whacks him on the face and says, return to your posts, which if I had the time, I'd re-Photoshop Gandalf with Biden's face. And the point is that if they want to surrender on day 1 or 2, it's very hard for the US to justify going in to defend Taiwan if Taiwan has already surrendered. Although I can't see any Taiwanese leader surrendering without being, no allies allow US basing. Where was Gondor when the Westfold burned? Effectively scenario, because I'm going to keep Lord of the Rings here. It becomes very difficult if there's no US allies willing to jump in on this scenario. Right now, if let's say no allies jump in, the US would have to run all of their air power effectively from their carriers and from Guam, or what's left of Guam, depending on what's got struck on day 1. That really limits the amount of runways, the amount of supply, the amount of planes, the depth and variation of planes you can use in this conflict. Whereas if you've got all of your Japanese airfields, all of your, particularly Japanese island airfields, you've got all of your Philippines airfields going, you've got carriers, you've got even long-range bombers coming out of Australia as an operational, open to as an option. It just makes it so much easier to do this. So is it possible the US can do it without allies? I would say yes. It's a much longer war. It's a much more costly war. And you start to get in where the odds go from like 95-5 that the US wins to like 70-30, 60-40, kind of down towards that road again. So it's a much easier time for China if the US are limited in their sorties per day to effectively what they can get off of carriers. Or they have to wait to bring carriers in from other places. Nuclear weapons. Obviously, it's much more difficult to model nuclear weapons. Again, China doesn't have a first strike nuclear policy. But if we go down that road, maybe someone blinks, and China. The last one is using Kinmen as bait. And this is the one I actually genuinely worry about. And speaking with lots of officials in US DoD, And from the Admiralty on this one, this is the one they really worry about as well. So let's go talk about Kinmen. This is Kinmen, as we went through earlier on, with its tiny little garrison here. Now, you can see it on the tiny map down here on the bottom left-hand corner. If Kinmen was to be taken by Chinese forces, whether it be security forces, whether in private military, whatever they are at the time, quickly in a very lightning operation, the same way Crimea was taken effectively, what is the US response? Because there'll be a push from some parts of Washington to go and save Kinmen, particularly as there will be protests against being occupied by mainland China. There will be footage that will come out, whether it's from Chinese state media, whether it's from leaked footage of protests being assaulted, or whether it's protesters just being dragged away. That will be broadcast across all of Asia. And if China starts really amping up the US aren't interested in defending Taiwan. They don't care. They're abandoning Taiwan. They're letting Taiwanese fall to the Chinese. Oh, how bad is that? It could break trust in the US and the region. That would be a big worry by State Department. Even to go back to the beginning of the Obama administration, where effectively China took the Scarborough Shoal just off the west coast of the Philippines. They seized these rocks, and they're damp rocks that are barely above water most of the time. They're technically in Philippine waters, though, and the US didn't start World War III over it. Even those damp, shitty rocks that no one was using, no one cared about, because China took them, it's something that the Philippines bring up all the time, and it's a massive thorn in the relationship between Washington and Manila. If you lose a town like Kinmen, which has got a population of about 60,000, the kickback you'll get from Taiwanese who either say, hey, why have we abandoned our brethren over in Taiwan? Or just the general East Asian community of like, hey, why is the US not actually doing anything about this? Will definitely worry State Department and a few other areas of government. Now, the trouble is that this is so close to the Chinese mainland that to go and send naval forces in there, again, like our bucket scenario we talked about a little bit earlier, you're now right in the den of Chinese coastal batteries. You are expecting that whatever you chuck in there is like 60, 70, maybe even 80% chance it gets shot and destroyed. So if the US was stupid enough to go, hey, we're going to land and take Kinmen back, A, China is not going to feel comfortable at all having US troops that close to the Chinese mainland. And B, you're just going to lose so many US troops. And at that point, let's say you've lost two or three carriers doing this, and you haven't even got stuff ashore or haven't got any things you can keep supplied ashore, then you might be chasing bad losses after bad losses. You might send more in. That's the worry here, is that this could become a political issue more than a military one, and that people could effectively go in and try and waste troops to get Kinmen back. Because if you take Kinmen back, you're going to lose hundreds of thousands of troops, and you're going to lose a lot of good naval equipment doing so. But you don't take Kinmen back now, you're going to have China waving it at everyone's face for a good long while. And that may affect US trade relationships right across the region. You're worried that China effectively goes to all the particularly guys at the Philippines and says, look, this is just proof the US don't care about East Asia. We're on the ascendancy, the US is on the decline, maybe you should join us. Is it true? No. Is it likely? Probably not. But this is out of the 5 possible models where China wins, this is the one effectively I worry about the most. It leaves it open to someone stepping on a rake and hurting themselves. I think we'll probably end up doing a whole piece on this. So this is where I took questions last time, but I am reticent that we're heading towards the sort of 2.5 hour mark. I answered most of the questions that I got had come up. So if you do have any questions further about this, always happy to hear them. You can chuck them in the Discord's question section. Otherwise, send me an email. I can try and answer them there. But my hope is that you enjoy this. You learned a bit about Taiwan, a bit about defense, a bit about supply, a bit about armies, a bit about everything else. And you have a better idea on why invading Taiwan is so difficult. In any case, though, to all our Patreons who tuned in for this one, all the people who tuned in for the original live stream, it was great. There was lots of jokes being cracked and a lot of great questions and lots of actual experts in the crowd. I could also kind of crowdsource some stuff off as well. Questions about investments, bonds and markets and all sorts of fun stuff. But it was great to chat to you then. Hopefully this re-record kind of makes up for the fact that the previous one was corrupted, which is always fun. And I hope everyone enjoyed it.